Now that we know everything there is to know about the target, let's start thinking about the primary antibody itself. You will need to think about if you want to use an antibody that is monoclonal, polyclonal, or recombinant. We do have a full course on those aspects, the antibodies ins and outs, so if you have questions, please refer to that Lambda U course. In short, polyclonal antibodies are cheaper and they work under a broad range of assay conditions. However, because of their clonality, they have the potential of giving you a higher background. Monoclonal antibodies are more specific, but unfortunately they will not work under such a broad range of assay conditions. Recombinant antibodies are extremely specific, but they're also very expensive, and unfortunately there's only a few options available in the market. Now that we have determined the antibody clonality, let's look at other details. And let's start with host reactivity. It is very important that your primary antibody is capable of recognizing the protein produced on your particular sample type. So if your sample is a mouse sample, you need to make sure that host reactivity includes mouse. Then we want to look at the host species, which is in which host was your primary antibody produced. The host species should be different than your host reactivity in preference. Then we're going to take notes of isotype and subclass of that antibody. And if you're planning on multiplexing different targets, you need to make sure that the isotype and subclasses will work well together. If you're planning on multiplexing two proteins that have a similar molecular weight, you want to make sure that you can image them on two different wavelengths. You can do that by using two primary antibodies that were generated in two different host species, such as a mouse and a rabbit antibody. You can also accomplish that by using antibodies that belong to two different subclasses, such as a mouse IgG2A and a mouse IgG2B. Now, if you're planning on targeting proteins that have different molecular weights, you can actually use antibodies generated on the same host species. If you have any questions on how to determine the host, isotype, or subclass of your antibodies, please refer to our other course, Antibodies Ins and Outs. In some cases, you may not be able to find some primary antibodies that you can multiplex together, perhaps because they were produced on the same host species. If that is the case, you may want to consider labeling your primary antibody. When you label your primary antibody, you will typically end up with less nonspecific background and with a shorter protocol because you're actually skipping the secondary antibody incubation step. However, exactly because you're skipping that step, you will also avoid having the signal amplification that is generated by the use of the secondary antibody. So use caution when you know or you expect to have low signal. In other situations, perhaps you can't find a primary antibody that binds to your target at all. If that is your case, then you may want to consider either creating those antibodies yourself or reaching out to a specialized vendor that can create those antibodies for you. Another alternative is to consider targeting other proteins of interest or perhaps adjusting your experimental conditions. Last but not least, make sure you verify that your primary antibody was QC or validated for your particular assay conditions.